A black woman is falsely accused of robbery, but they didn't know who her husband was. In the busy streets of New York City, where skyscrapers stretch toward the sky and people move in a constant rush, lives are intertwined in unexpected ways. Among the sea of people, no one really pays attention to others unless something catches their eye. It was an ordinary afternoon when Amelia Johnson, a poised, confident woman in her early 40s, decided to visit the Madison Avenue Jewelry Gallery. She had spent weeks planning for this day, wanting to surprise her husband, Derek, with something special for their anniversary. Amelia wasn't just any customer. She was a successful lawyer, well known in the city, with a reputation for her advocacy, work in fighting for equality. Her goal was simple: find the perfect piece of jewelry that would capture the 10 years she and Derek had spent together. But little did she know, this simple shopping trip was about to unravel a dark, hidden reality about prejudice and power. The jewelry store on Madison Avenue was known for its elite clientele. The exterior gleamed with polished glass windows showcasing glittering diamonds and gold, each piece promising wealth and status. As Amelia stepped into the store, she admired the elegant displays and the quiet atmosphere, stark contrast to the chaotic city outside. She walked over to one of the glass cases, her eyes scanning a selection of necklaces. A stunning diamond pendant caught her attention as she gazed at it, imagining how Derek's eyes would light up when he saw it. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Can I help you with something?" Amelia looked up to see a store employee, a tall blonde woman standing behind the counter. Her expression was cold, her tone clipped and professional, but with an undercurrent of something else, something less polite. "Yes, I'd like to see this necklace, please," Amelia said, pointing at the diamond pendant that had caught her attention. The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced at Amelia. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flicker of judgment, a questioning look, as if Amelia didn't belong in a place like this. She unlocked the glass case and handed Amelia the necklace with a forced smile. As Amelia held the necklace, admiring the way the light reflected off the diamonds, she sensed the woman's eyes on her. It wasn't just curiosity, it felt like suspicion. Amelia had experienced this before, that subtle questioning of her presence. The silent assumptions made about her, because of her skin color, even in spaces she had every right to be in. Trying to ignore the discomfort, Amelia smiled politely and asked, "How much is this?" The woman's lips tightened before she responded, "Are you sure you can afford this?" Amelia's heart skipped a beat. The words stung, not because she couldn't afford the necklace, but because of what they implied. She had encountered prejudice before, but this moment felt different. It was more than an offhand comment. It was a direct challenge to her dignity. Keeping her voice calm, Amelia responded, "Yes, I'm sure." The employee's eyes flickered with something close to annoyance as she reached out to take the necklace. "Back. I think it would be better if you returned it to the case," she said louder this time. Drawing the attention of the other customers in the store, Amelia's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She carefully placed the necklace back on the velvet pad. "There's no need for that," she said firmly, trying to maintain her composure. But it was too late. The employee had already signaled to a nearby security guard who was now walking toward them. The store had grown quieter as customers turned to watch the unfolding scene. Amelia could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. The guard, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped in front of her. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking first at the employee and then at Amelia. "This woman was trying to steal that necklace," the employee said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Amelia's stomach dropped. The accusation was so sudden, so outrageous, that for a moment she couldn't even find the words to respond. She hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here she was, being accused of theft in front of everyone. "I wasn't," Amelia started, but the guard cut her off. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Amelia could feel the humiliation rising in her chest. She wanted to scream, to demand justice, right there and then, but she knew that wouldn't help. Fighting back would only escalate the situation. Instead, she took a deep breath and nodded. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with controlled anger. "Let's go." As she walked out of the store, the other customers' eyes followed her. Some were whispering, others were pulling out their phones to record the scene. Amelia kept her head high, refusing to let them see how deeply this moment had hurt her. In the security office, the guard asked her to sit down while they reviewed the footage. Amelia's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. How had a simple shopping trip turned into this? And why? She knew the answer, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. After what felt like an eternity, the guard returned, his expression softer now, almost apologetic. "We've reviewed the footage," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong? You're free to go." Amelia nodded, but the damage had already been done. She thanked the guard quietly and left the office, her thoughts still spinning. As she walked through the mall, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. It wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger, the casual racism that people like her faced every day. The assumptions made about them based on nothing more than the color of their skin. When Amelia got home that evening, her husband Derek was waiting. For her, she tried to keep her emotions in check, but as she recounted the events at the store, the anger and hurt spilled out. Derek listened quietly, his expression growing darker with each word. "They treated you like a criminal?" he asked, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. "In my city? In my mall?" Amelia nodded. "It was awful," she said. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain. Everyone was watching, and it felt like they had already decided I was guilty." Derek stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "This isn't over," he said. "We're going to do something about this. They can't get away with treating you like that." Amelia's heart swelled with gratitude. She knew Derek would stand by her, but more than that, she knew he had the power to make things right. Derek wasn't just her husband. He was the owner of the very mall where the incident had taken place. And now, he was ready to use his influence to fight back against the injustice she had faced. The next morning, Amelia met with Marcus, the security guard who had cleared her name the day before. They sat down at a cafe near the mall, where Marcus apologized once again for what had happened. "I'm really sorry you had to go through that," Marcus said, shaking his head. "I could tell something wasn't right from the beginning, but I had to follow protocol." "I understand," Amelia said. "But we need to do more than just clear my name. This isn't just about me. It's about how people like me are treated every day. We need to expose what's happening." Marcus nodded. "I agree," he said. "I've seen this happen to other customers before. It's not right." Amelia's resolve hardened. "Then we need to gather evidence. I want to hold that store accountable, and I need your help." Over the next few weeks, Amelia and Marcus worked together to uncover the truth. They interviewed employees, reviewed more security footage, and gathered testimonies from other customers who had experienced similar discrimination at the jewelry store. Each story added another layer to the injustice, painting a picture of a pattern of racial profiling and prejudice that had gone unchecked for too long. One day, while reviewing financial records and employee files, Marcus made a shocking discovery. The store's manager, Claire Benson, had been in contact with a man named Richard Evans, a businessman who had been trying to buy out Derek's mall for years. It was clear now that this was more than just an isolated incident. Richard Evans was using the store's discriminatory practices as a way to undermine Derek's business and force him to sell. Amelia couldn't believe it. What had started as a personal act of racism had turned out to be part of a much larger conspiracy. She and Derek were being targeted not just because of who they were, but because of the power they held. With this new information in hand, Amelia and Marcus knew they had to act quickly. They gathered all the evidence they had collected, the security footage, the testimonies, the financial records, and prepared to confront the store's management. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Amelia, Derek, Marcus, and a few trusted employees walked into the store with their evidence in hand. The store manager, Claire Benson, was waiting for them, her expression cold and unyielding. "We know what you've been doing," Amelia said, her voice steady. "We have evidence of your discriminatory practices, and we know about your connection to Richard Evans. This stops now." For a moment, Claire looked shaken, but she quickly recovered, her face hardening into a mask of defiance. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, crossing her arms. Derek stepped forward, his presence commanding. You've been caught, he said, his voice low and firm. We have enough evidence to take this to court. Believe me, we will. Unless you want to lose everything, I suggest you cooperate. Claire's face paled as she realized the gravity of the situation. After a tense silence, she finally relented. What do you want? We want accountability, Amelia said. You'll publicly admit what you've done and step down as manager. And you'll make sure that your employees undergo training to prevent this from ever happening again. Claire hesitated for a moment before nodding. All right, she said. I'll do it. With that, the confrontation was over. Before Amelia and Derek, the fight had only just begun. They knew that this was about more than just one store. It was about changing the way people of color were treated in spaces of power and privilege. They weren't going to stop until justice was served. A few days later, Amelia and Derek held a press conference to share their story with the world. The media turned out in droves, eager to hear about the scandal that had rocked one of New York's most prestigious shopping centers. As they stood in front of the cameras, Amelia felt a surge of determination. This was her moment to speak out, to demand change, and to hold those who had wronged her accountable. This isn't just about me, Amelia said, her voice clear and strong. It's about the countless people who face discrimination every day simply because of the color of their skin. It's about justice, and it's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. Derek stepped up next, presenting the evidence they had gathered, the security footage, the testimonies, the financial records. As the reporters took it all in, murmurs of shock and disbelief rippled through the crowd. We are calling for immediate action, Derek said, his voice firm. This is not just a personal matter. It's a matter of public accountability, and we won't rest until justice is done. By the end of the day, the press conference had gone viral. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Amelia and Derek. With people across the country calling for change, the pressure on the store's management was immense. And within days, Claire Benson had stepped down as manager. New policies were put in place to ensure that no customer would ever face discrimination again. Amelia and Derek had won, but the victory was bittersweet. The scars of that day in the jewelry store would never fully heal, but they had turned their pain into power, using their platform to bring about real change. And in the end, that's what mattered most. As Amelia looked back on the journey, she knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But she also knew that they had made a difference. They had shown that prejudice, no matter how deeply ingrained, could be challenged. And they had proven that, in the end, justice always prevails. Days after the press conference, Amelia's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from people expressing their support. Some were friends, some were strangers who had seen the story on the news. The response had been overwhelming. Messages poured in from people who had gone through similar experiences, their voices finally finding a platform in Amelia's story. Amelia felt a deep sense of responsibility. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had been wrongfully accused, belittled, or treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. But with this growing responsibility came increasing pressure. One afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table, Derek noticed Amelia deep in thought, her phone buzzing beside her, untouched. He put down his cup of coffee and reached across the table to take her hand. "You've been quiet, Derek," said softly. His eyes filled with concern. "What's on your mind?" Amelia sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's just ... all of this. It feels bigger than me now. I'm glad we spoke out, but there's so much more to do. The more I think about it, the more I realize how much change is still needed. And I'm not sure if I'm ready for all of it." Derek squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to do it all at once," he said. "You've already made a huge impact. You're opening doors for others. Ow! But don't forget to take care of yourself in the process." Amelia gave him a small smile, appreciating his support. He always knew how to ground her when things felt overwhelming. But she also knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Her voice had been amplified, and now there were expectations. People were looking to her to continue pushing for change. Later that week, Amelia received a call from Marcus. "Hey, I've been doing some digging," he said, his tone serious. "I think you need to know something." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "Was going through some old reports and found out that this isn't the first time. There's been trouble at that jewelry store. There have been other complaints, racial profiling, discriminatory treatment, the whole thing, but it's been buried." Amelia frowned. "How is that possible? How has no one said anything before?" "That's the thing," Marcus replied. "People did say something, but the management hushed it up, paid off some of the victims, threatened others with legal action if they went public. They've been covering this up for years." Amelia's stomach turned. This was worse than she had thought. What had happened to her was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue for far too long. She knew she couldn't let this slide. If the jewelry store had been doing this for years, then it was time to make sure they were held accountable for all of it. "We need to go public with this," Amelia said. "All of it. The people who were silenced before deserve justice." "I agree," Marcus said. "But we'll need more than just what we have now. We need people to come forward, share their stories." Amelia thought for a moment. "I'll take care of that. I'll reach out to the media, see if we can get people to speak up." Over the next few days, Amelia worked tirelessly. She contacted reporters, lawyers, and civil rights organizations, determined to build a case that would expose the store's history of discriminatory practices. Slowly but surely, former customers who had been wronged came forward, sharing their experiences of being mistreated or unfairly targeted at the jewelry store. One woman, a single mother named Linda, recounted how she had been accused of trying to return stolen jewelry simply because the store couldn't find her in their system. "They treated me like I was some kind of criminal," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't even have the strength to fight them at the time. I just left humiliated." Another man, Carlos, had been stopped by security after browsing for wedding rings with his fiancée. "They didn't believe I was serious about buying anything," he said bitterly. "They assumed because of how I looked that I couldn't afford any of it." Each story was a painful reminder of how deeply embedded these prejudices were. It became clear that this wasn't just a problem with one employee or even one store. It was part of a systemic issue that affected far too many people. Amelia organized a second press conference. This time she wasn't just speaking for herself. She invited Linda, Carlos, and several other victims to stand with her. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as Amelia took the podium. "I'm standing here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel less than because of who they are," Amelia began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What happened to me at this jewelry store wasn't an accident. It was part of a pattern of behavior that has been going on for years, and today we are here to expose it." She motioned to Linda, who stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly. "I was accused of stealing, humiliated in front of my daughter," Linda said, her voice quivering. "But I stayed silent because I was scared. I'm not scared anymore." Next, Carlos shared his story, his anger palpable as he recounted how he had been treated like a second-class citizen simply because of the color of his skin. "I'm done being silent," he said. "This stops now." Amelia spoke again, her words striking a chord with everyone in the room. "You're not asking for much," she said. "You're asking for what should be given freely to everyone: respect, dignity, and the right to exist without being judged based on assumptions. And we will not stop until we see real change." The press conference was a turning point. The media coverage was intense, and soon the story was everywhere. People across the country were calling for accountability, demanding that the jewelry store face consequences for its actions. The pressure became too much for the store's corporate office. Within days, they issued a public apology, announcing that they would be conducting an internal investigation and implementing mandatory diversity training for all employees. Claire Benson, the manager who had allowed the discrimination to continue unchecked, was permanently removed from her position. But for Amelia, that wasn't enough. She knew there was more to be done. Behind the scenes, Amelia and Marcus were building a legal case against the store. They worked with a team of lawyers, gathering all the evidence. They had collected testimonies, documents, security footage, everything they could use to make sure that justice was fully served. Weeks turned into months as they prepared for the trial. It was a long and grueling process, but Amelia was determined to see it through. She spent countless hours in meetings with lawyers, preparing to testify and strategizing their approach. Derek stood by her side every step of the way, his support unwavering. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Amelia took the stand. She was nervous, but she knew what was at stake. She had to speak her truth, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged. As she recounted the events of that day in the jewelry store, the room grew silent. Every eye was on her. Every word she spoke carried the weight of the injustice she had faced. When she finished, there was a palpable tension in the air. One by one, the other victims testified, their stories weaving together a damning picture of the store's discriminatory practices. The defense tried to argue that these were isolated incidents, mistakes made by individual employees, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, the jury found the jewelry store guilty of racial discrimination and ordered them to pay a substantial settlement to the victims. But more than that, the store was required to implement sweeping changes to their policies, ensuring that something like this could never happen again. As Amelia walked out of the courthouse, a sense of relief washed over her. The fight had been long and exhausting, but they had won. Justice had been served. But more importantly, they had made a difference. In the weeks that followed, Amelia found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She had started this journey as a victim, humiliated and wrongfully accused, but she had emerged stronger, more determined, and with a clearer sense of purpose. One evening, as she and Derek sat in their living room, the sun setting outside the window, Amelia turned to him. "Do you think we've really made a difference?" she asked quietly. Derek smiled, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We have. You have. You stood up for yourself and for so many others. And you showed people that they don't have to be afraid to fight for what's right." Amelia nodded, resting her head against his chest. "I just hope that people don't forget what this was all about." "They won't," Derek said softly. "You've sparked something, Amelia. Change is slow, but it's happening. And it's because of people like you who are willing to stand up and say, enough." As they sat there together, Amelia felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she had proven that it was possible to push back against injustice, to make the world a little bit fairer, one step at a time. And that was a victory worth celebrating. Life slowly started returning to normal for Amelia and Derek, though normal now felt different. The battle they had just fought left them more aware of the world around them and of the responsibility they carried as people in positions of influence. Amelia found herself constantly being approached by people, whether it was in the street, at events, or even online, thanking her for what she had done. Some shared their own stories of injustice, while others simply expressed admiration for her bravery. But one thing became clear: people were watching, and they were expecting more. Amelia realized that what had started as a fight for her own dignity had grown into something far larger, a call for change in systems of power and prejudice. Afternoon, as Amelia sat at her desk, sifting through emails, she came across a message that caught her eye. It was from a young woman named Kendra, who wrote about her own experiences facing discrimination in her workplace. Kendra worked at a high-end retail store in Manhattan and had repeatedly been passed over for promotions despite her qualifications. When she questioned the decisions, her supervisors made thinly veiled comments about how certain clients preferred to be helped by people who looked a certain way. It was all too familiar. "I feel like I'm trapped in this situation," Kendra wrote. "I know what they're doing is wrong, but I'm afraid to speak up. If I do, I could lose my job, and I need this job to support my family. But I can't keep pretending like everything's fine." As Amelia read Kendra's words, she felt a familiar fire ignite inside her. She knew exactly how Kendra felt: the helplessness, the fear of losing everything if you dared to push back. But Amelia also knew that staying silent wasn't the answer. Amelia decided to meet with Kendra in person. They arranged to meet at a small cafe near Kendra's workplace. When they met, Amelia could see the exhaustion in Kendra's eyes, the weight of carrying this burden for so long. Over coffee, Kendra opened up about everything she had been through: the microaggressions, the way her supervisors would dismiss her concerns, the blatant favoritism shown to her white colleagues. It was all too familiar. "I'm scared," Kendra admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. If I speak up, they'll find a way to push me out. They've done it before with other employees. I've seen it happen." Amelia listened carefully, her heart heavy with empathy. "You're not alone in this," she said gently. "I know it feels like you are, but you're not. You don't have to fight this battle on your own." Kendra looked at her eyes searching Amelia's face for some kind of reassurance. "But what can I do? I can't afford to lose my job." Amelia took a deep breath. "You don't have to go through this alone," she repeated. "We can bring attention to what's happening. We can make sure they know that you have support. And if they try to retaliate, we'll make sure the public knows exactly what they're doing." Kendra was silent for a moment, processing Amelia's words. She was scared, that much was clear. But Amelia could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, a tiny spark that told her Kendra was ready to fight, even if it was terrifying. "Okay," Kendra said finally, her voice steadying. "I'll do it. I'll speak up." The decision wasn't made lightly. Amelia knew that once Kendra took this step, there would be no going back. But she also knew that silence was no longer an option. Too many people had stayed silent for too long, and it was time for things to change. Amelia reached out to her network of legal contacts, connecting Kendra with a lawyer who specialized in employment discrimination cases. They worked together to document everything: the comments, the promotions she had been passed over for, the times her concerns were dismissed. With every detail they uncovered, the case against the retail store grew stronger. In the meantime, Amelia continued her advocacy work, now more determined than ever to push for change on a larger scale. She had become a voice for those who felt they had no one to turn to, and that voice was growing louder with each passing day. As Kendra's case gained traction, the media once again took notice. News outlets began covering the story, drawing parallels between Kendra's experience and Amelia's own battle against the jewelry store. The public was outraged, and pressure mounted on the retail store to respond. LEGATIONS, head-on. The store's management tried to sweep it under the rug, much like they had done in the past. But this time, the world was watching. As Kendra's legal team built their case, more employees came forward, sharing their own stories of discrimination within the company. It became clear that Kendra's experience was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem. The company had created a culture where people of color were systematically sidelined, their contributions ignored, and their opportunities stifled. When the case finally went to court, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Reporters filled the gallery and outside. Protesters gathered with signs demanding justice for Kendra and all those who had been wronged by the company's discriminatory practices. Amelia sat in the courtroom, watching as Kendra took the stand. She had come a long way from the scared young woman who had reached out for help. Now she spoke with confidence, recounting her experiences with clarity and determination. Her voice was strong, and though her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone, there was no mistaking the resolve in her words. "I worked hard," Kendra said, her voice unwavering. "I earned the right to be considered for those promotions, just like everyone else. But I was never given a fair chance. And that's not right." The defense tried to paint Kendra as disgruntled, someone who was simply unhappy with her position and looking for an excuse to blame the company. But the evidence was irrefutable. The testimonies from other employees, the emails, the patterns of favoritism, it all pointed to a system that had been designed to hold people like Kendra back. In the end, the jury sided with Kendra. The company was found guilty of discriminatory practices and ordered to pay a significant settlement. But more importantly, they were required to implement sweeping changes to their hiring and promotion policies, as well as mandatory diversity training for all employees. The victory was a major milestone not just for Kendra, but for everyone who had been wronged by the company's actions. It sent a powerful message that discrimination would no longer be tolerated, that those who sought to oppress and marginalize others would be held accountable. As Amelia and Kendra walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the victory settled over them. Kendra was smiling, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "Thank you," Kendra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't think I could have done this without you," Amelia smiled, pulling her into a warm embrace. "You did this," she said softly. "I just helped you see that you could." The case made headlines for weeks, sparking a national conversation about discrimination in the workplace and the importance of creating systems that allowed everyone, regardless of race or background, to thrive. Companies across the country began reassessing their own policies, afraid of being the next target of a public scandal. For Amelia, the fight wasn't over, but she knew they had made progress. They had taken a stand, and they had one. And with each victory, the path forward became a little clearer. Back home. As Amelia and Derek sat together one evening, the quiet hum of the city outside their window, Derek glanced at her, his eyes filled with admiration. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I always knew you were strong. But watching you these last few months, I've never been prouder of you." Amelia smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through finally beginning to lift. But even as they enjoyed this quiet moment of peace, Amelia's mind was already racing toward the future. "There was so much more to be done, I was thinking," Amelia said after a while, "about starting an organization, something bigger. Something that could help people like Kindra people who don't have the resources or the voice to fight back on their own." Derek smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I think that's a brilliant idea, and I think you're just the person to do it." Amelia's heart swelled with excitement. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth fighting for ever was. The journey ahead was long, but she was ready. She had already proven to herself and to the world that one person could make a difference. And now she was ready to take that difference even further. A few weeks after Kendra's case wrapped up, Amelia couldn't shake the idea of building something bigger, an organization that could not only help people like Kendra, but also challenge systemic injustice across industries. She had seen firsthand how powerful it could be to give people a platform to speak out. But she knew that many others still remained silent, too afraid, or too unsure of where to turn. Amelia spent days mapping out her vision. She wanted to create a place where anyone facing discrimination could find legal support, emotional guidance, and most importantly, the courage to fight back. This wouldn't just be a law firm. It would be a movement, a rallying point for people from all walks of life who believed in equality and justice. One evening, after she had scribbled out the 100th idea on a notepad, Derek looked up from across the room. "You've been busy," he said with a smile, nodding toward the papers that covered the dining table. "I have," Amelia replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "I think I'm ready to start building this thing, but I'm going to need help." Derek stood up, walking over to the table and glancing over her notes. "You'll get it," he said confidently. "There are people out there who want to see change just as much as you do. All you have to do is ask." Amelia nodded, grateful for his unwavering support. She knew Derek was right. She couldn't do this alone, and she didn't have to. Over the next few weeks, Amelia reached out to people in her network, lawyers, activists, community leaders even. Some of the people who had stood by her during her fight with the jewelry store. The response was overwhelming. Word began to spread, and before long, people were offering their support. Eager to be part of something that promised real change, Amelia held meetings in small conference rooms, living rooms, and cafes, discussing strategy, resources, and goals. She was determined that this organization, which she eventually named the Justice Collective, would be more than just another nonprofit. It would be a force for accountability and fairness, a place where people could come not only to find justice for themselves, but to demand systemic change. The launch of the Justice Collective came quicker than expected. With a handful of passionate individuals working alongside her, Amelia organized a public event to announce the organization. They rented out a local community center, inviting anyone who wanted to learn more about their mission. The night of the launch, the hall was packed with people of all ages, races, and backgrounds. There were reporters from local news stations, lawyers eager to lend their expertise, and activists ready to mobilize their communities. Some people came out of curiosity, others because they had been personally affected by discrimination. But they all had one thing in common. They wanted to be part of something that would make a difference. Amelia took the stage, her heart pounding with anticipation. As she looked out at the crowd, she felt a rush of gratitude for everyone who had supported her up until this point. This was bigger than she had ever imagined, but it was exactly what she had hoped for. "Thank you all for being here," Amelia began, her voice strong but filled with emotion. The Justice Collective was born out of a personal fight for dignity and respect, and it has grown into something much larger. We are here today because we believe that no one should have to fight injustice alone. We are here because we know that change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen when we stand together. The crowd erupted in applause, the energy in the room electric. "Now, this is just the beginning," she continued. "We have a long road ahead. But with every case we take on, every voice we amplify, and every system we hold accountable, we are moving closer to the world we know is possible, a world where no one is judged by the color of their skin, their gender, their background, or their beliefs. A world where justice is not just a word, but a reality for everyone." By the time the event ended, the Justice Collective had already gained dozens of new supporters, volunteers, and donations. It was clear that the organization had struck a chord with people who were tired of waiting for someone else to make things right. They wanted to be part of the change. In the months that followed, the Justice Collective grew rapidly. Amelia and her team took on cases ranging from workplace discrimination to housing injustice to police misconduct. Every victory they won, every policy they helped change, made them stronger and more determined. But the work wasn't easy. For every step forward, there were moments of frustration and setbacks. Some cases dragged on for years, bogged down by legal bureaucracy and resistance from powerful corporations. There were times when Amelia wondered if they were really making a difference or if they were simply fighting an endless battle against a system that refused to change. During one particularly grueling class action lawsuit against a national retailer accused of widespread discrimination, Amelia found herself questioning whether she had taken on too much. The retailer's legal team was well-funded. They fought back with every tool at their disposal, dragging out the process and attempting to discredit the plaintiffs at every turn. One night, after a long day in court, Amelia came home exhausted, barely able to keep her eyes open. Derek was waiting for her, and as soon as he saw the look on her face, he knew something was wrong. "I don't know if I can do this," Amelia admitted, sinking into the couch. "This case... it's too big. They're too powerful. It feels like no matter what we do, they're always one step ahead." Derek sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've come this far, Amelia. Don't forget what you've already accomplished. These things take time, but you're fighting the right fight, and that's what matters." Amelia sighed, leaning her head back against the cushion. "I just don't want to let anyone down. So many people are counting on us." "You won't let them down," Derek said gently. "Not fighting alone. You've built something incredible here, and you have a team that believes in the same things you do. Trust them. Trust yourself." Amelia nodded, feeling a small spark of hope reignite in her chest. She knew Derek was right. She couldn't lose sight of the bigger picture, the change they were working toward. Even if it felt slow, a few months later, the case against the retailer reached a breakthrough. After years of legal battles, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, finding that the company had indeed engaged in discriminatory practices. The victory was monumental, not just for the individuals involved, but for the message it sent across the country that no company, no matter how powerful, could escape accountability.